Okay, good evening, everyone. You're very welcome. My name's Jane Stout. I'm a professor in botany at Trinity College Dublin, and I'm the chair of the Irish Forum on Natural Capital. And I'd like to welcome you all to this session this evening. Dieter got in touch with us and offered to give a talk to our students. And so the idea for this event was really to bring Dieter together with our master's students in Trinity, so the masters in environmental science, in biodiversity and conservation, in energy, and the masters in development practice. So welcome to the students from those programs. But we decided to broaden out to a wider audience to have an opportunity for more people to join us. So you're all very welcome this evening. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. I think your microphones are all muted. Please keep your microphones muted. What we're going to do in terms of the questions is that just before Dieter finishes speaking, we'll turn on the chat function, and then you'll be able to type your questions into the chat, or you can speak your questions, and we'll have a chance for a Q&A at the end of the session. So the other thing I need to tell you is that we are recording this session, and so if you don't want to appear on the recording, then please keep your camera turned off as well. So this session, as I say, it's being co-organised by Trinity and the Irish Forum on Natural Capital. So just a bit of an introduction to the forum for those of you who don't know about it. It's a not-for-profit organisation which the conversation in natural capital in Ireland. And at the moment, we have more than 750 members from across academia, the public, the private, and the NGO sectors. And the mission of the forum is to value, protect, and restore Ireland's natural capital. And the concept of natural capital can be controversial, but it's an economic metaphor for nature. And the language specifically is used to engage business, economics, financial sectors that traditionally have had little engagement with nature, and which this has obviously contributed to unsustainable use of nature. To find out more about the forum or to join as a member, you can visit naturalcapitalireland.com. So it gives us a great pleasure to introduce Professor Dieter Helm, who is the chair of the UK Natural Capital Committee and has been a friend to the Irish Forum on Natural Capital for many years now. Dieter is Professor of Economic Policy at Oxford University and has written many books on actions to combat climate change and environmental degradation. He's provided extensive advice to the UK government and to the European Commission. He's chairman of the Natural Capital Research Organisation and honorary vice president of one of the UK wildlife trusts. So a vast range of experience. And he's going to speak to us this evening on action to tackle the climate emergency. So you're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Dieter.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much to the Natural Capital Forum. You do great stuff. The motivation of what I'm going to say on net zero is the counterpoint between the obvious engagement of a very large number of people, and now most, if not all, European governments on climate change. I mean, it's really shifted dramatically to a point where there's almost a competition between governments to show that they're the most serious in this territory, and the almost total lack of progress in actually addressing climate change. And it's an extraordinary, conflicting position. So if you look back over the last 30 years of effort to do something about climate change, what you observe is that every single year since 1990, we've added 2 parts per million to the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And that's the only number that matters, because that's what causes climate change, which is the change in the composition of our atmosphere, and in particular, the carbon component of that. I'm using carbon for to cover the greenhouse gases. And so I asked myself this question: how can so many people, so much money, and so much resources be spent on addressing climate change, and we get virtually nowhere? We're on 417 parts per million, And during the great financial crash, which of course you're very familiar with in Ireland in 2007, 2008, and in the coronavirus, we're still adding 2 parts per million to the atmosphere. So if you think about that, you are forced to ask the question, so what do you need to do to actually make a difference and turn this terrible trend, which is linear, in fact, arguably getting slightly worse than linear, around before we get to 2 degrees or 3 degrees. So that's my motivation. And my agenda for this evening, if we can move to the next slide, is first of all to go back to basics and fundamentals and ask, what does net zero really mean? And I think there are some surprising dimensions of that. Then to ask the question, which I think people who sign up to net zero think that they are signing up to, which is, what should a unilateral net zero policy look like? What should it look like if a country, or even you as an individual, and I'll come to that at the end of the discussion, decide that you no longer want to cause climate change? Remember, climate change is global. It doesn't care about location, either for where sequestration or emissions take place. So I'm going to ask, so if you really want not to cause any more climate change, what do you really have to do? And behind that will lie some core principles and some core policies. I want to explain why the polluter pays principle is absolutely central to this, why a carbon tax, a proper carbon price, is a necessary component of any credible unilateral net zero policy. And then I want to look at some of the natural capital dimensions of that, in particular natural capital sequestration, and of course the infrastructures, including the green infrastructure and the R&D that lies behind that. And at the end of my 30 minutes or so, I'm going to bring it right back to you each individual, us, and look at how you might look at your own personal carbon consumption. And I'm going to suggest you get going on a carbon diary to illustrate that. So that's my agenda. So the first issue is, what does net zero really mean? Now, some people think that net zero is all about reducing emissions. Indeed, they think that's all it's about. But if you look at our atmosphere, it's maintained a balance, a rough balance. There's been climate change, of course, in the past, but a rough balance for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, because the concentration in the atmosphere is the balance of the emissions that are going up into the atmosphere and the sequestration that our natural environment's engaged in taking back out again. All that peat in Northern Ireland is part of a long process of sequestration. And of course, if it's burnt in power stations, it becomes emissions, or if it's overgrazed on the top, it goes on to the emissions side of the balance. But what we've got to do in order to address net zero, not zero emissions, but net zero emissions, is to bring this back into balance. So we've got to increase sequestration, some CCS, but mainly get our natural environment back into a decent state to start absorbing that, and reduce emissions as well. And for example, we can't go on burning down the Amazon, causing the emissions that come from burning down the Amazon, and destroying the ability of the Amazon to sequestrate future carbon in order to produce beef to import into the European market, for example. And I'll come back to how some of those things work out. So have in mind that we're as much concerned with sequestration and the natural environment's role in this as we are in emissions, and we have to work on both sides of the equation. So what should a unilateral net zero policy look like? Well, as I quote in the next slide, that is a function of, can we have the next slide? Is that possible? Yeah, great. This is what the Climate Change Committee in Britain stated in 2019 in trying to persuade the British government to adopt a net zero statutory unilateral policy. The document says the following: by reducing emissions produced in the UK to zero, we also end our contribution to rising global temperature. Well, I struggle to think what could possibly be right about that statement. Okay, nobody in their right minds should want to reduce emissions to zero. Our planet is built on carbon. It's net zero, so the balance of emissions and sequestration. And if we do this on a territorial basis, even if we make it net zero, we will not have stopped our contribution to rising global temperatures. And this lies behind the reason why, despite all the efforts we've made so far, those emissions and sequestration have conspired to add 2 parts per million every single year over the last 30 wasted years. So what it should look like is what's on the next slide, which is we should be saying when we get to net zero carbon consumption, we will no longer be causing climate change. And the point I want to make is actually simple, but it has profound implications. What matters is not territorial carbon emissions. It doesn't matter where the emissions take place. What matters is carbon consumption, our true carbon footprint, recognizing that carbon knows no boundaries, and recognizing that it doesn't help to address climate change if you close down your energy and carbon intensive industries, tick the box, territorial emissions have gone down, and then simply import the stuff from places like China. So back to the example of the burning of the rainforest and the beef in Brazil. We could close down the beef industry in Ireland. We could close down the dairy industry too. And there would be an enormous reduction in emissions in Ireland because Ireland has a big problem of emissions associated with the agricultural sector. But we wouldn't have done anything about climate change if we simply import the beef from Brazil or the dairy products from other countries and our consumption remains constant. In fact, we'll almost certainly have made it worse. So when we were discussing it in the UK in 2019 about adopting the net zero target, we were also having a discussion about whether the government should bail out British Steel or let it go bust. Well, if you want to achieve net zero carbon territorial production targets, the best thing you could do is close down British Steel and import the stuff from China. Oh, and close down Grangemouth Petrochemicals plant too. Oh, and hope that Brexit kills off the car industry completely. And then we can finish our deindustrialization. We're at 80% services in the UK, 20% manufacturing, claim that we're the great success story in climate change, leave the population with the delusion that they're no longer causing climate change, and actually make climate change worse. And if you think this one through, and you look where the emissions have come from in the last 30 years, the big story in climate change for 30 years is China, 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 oh, and probably a bit of India and Africa too, but then China, China, and China. China was doubling the size of its economy every 7 years. Even on its current lower growth rate of 5%, it's going to be twice its current size by 2035 and 4 times its current size by 2050. So you have to ask yourself, if you care about climate change, can the world stand 4 times China as its current economy is before we get to 2050? And the answer, by the way, is blatantly obvious. Obviously not. And anyone who gets terribly excited by China committing to being a carbon, inverted commas, neutral by 2060 has to take into account the envelope of emissions between now and 2060. And I can assure you, on current projections, we're going to fry before 2060, before China's commitment to be carbon neutral may or may not be achieved. Now, it's easy to say, well, it's all China's fault. Of course it's not. What are those emissions for? Well, a lot of those emissions are for you and me, for Europe and the United States, which is still at least half the world's economy. And indeed, the whole China expansion growth story was based, as the Japanese growth miracle before was, and South Korea, on exporting energy and carbon intensive goods. So the question we have to address is not whether we are causing emissions in the UK or in Ireland, but whether we are reducing our carbon consumption in Europe and in UK and in Ireland, and indeed in the United States too. So if you want to stop causing climate change, even if we might not actually end up stopping climate change as a whole, but if you personally no longer want to be responsible for carbon emissions, and if you want your country to unilaterally commit not to do that, and that's what all those pledges are at Paris and are going to be at COP26 coming on, then you have to pledge that you're not going to allow your carbon consumption to increase. In fact, you're going to reduce it and reduce it substantially. And when you recognize that, you have to take imports into account, and you realize that making a difference on climate change is a hell of a lot more demanding than the idea of simply meeting the net zero carbon territorial production targets. So that's why I think that you have to look at carbon consumption, and that's why I think we're utterly flattered in Europe by our carbon territorial production numbers, because Europe has been deindustrializing since 1990. I don't know of a single energy intensive investment taking place in Europe at all at the moment. I keep throwing that out, hoping someone will contradict me, but we're not doing it. The United States is, lots of other places in the world are, but Europe has flattered its carbon numbers. And of course, choosing 1990 as a baseline is, of course, the year in which the Soviet Union collapsed, and therefore a huge number of incredibly inefficient and carbon-intensive companies and industries collapsed. So we are responsible for some of those emissions in China. China is overwhelmingly a coal-based economy. It's half the total world coal trade. And just in case you think China has suddenly seen the light, and there are quite a lot of people in the climate world who think China good, United States bad, I'll make two observations. The first is China is currently building about 148 gigawatts of new coal, which is more new coal power stations than the entire coal capacity of Europe. And if you look at the trajectory of that going forward, you'll observe that that is completely incompatible with any reasonable carbon ambition. China is also financing a lot of coal being built abroad. Even if it reduces the share of coal in its total energy mix from about 60 or 70% down, when the economy doubles within 15 years, you've got to bring the percentage down a long way before you've actually brought down the total volume of coal burn. But just to make sure that I haven't singled out China, Germany built 13 gigawatts of new coal since 2000 and won't even phase out its coal till 2036 or 2038, leaving the dirtiest coal to phase out last. So we've got a long way to go in this frame, but it's carbon consumption that matters. And that brings us to the core principles and the next slide as to how we actually do unilateral net zero carbon consumption. So at the absolute heart of any consumption-based approach is the idea that that consumption which is polluting should be costed and charged, that the polluter should pay for the pollution that's being caused. It's actually 101 economics. An efficient economy incorporates all the costs. And so therefore not to price the externalities like carbon is to have an inefficient set of prices and therefore an inefficient economy. So the polluter pays is absolutely central. But just bear in mind who the polluter is. It's you and me, because industry exists to produce stuff for us. Nobody drills oil for the fun of drilling oil. They drill oil because you and I will fill up our car with oil, we'll buy plastics made from oil, and we'll use oil in heating, etc. Nobody bothers to make that plastic for the fun of it. It's because you and I are ultimately going to use it. It's going to wrap our food and all sorts of other things. So it's easy to say, oh yeah, but the polluters, these ghastly businesses, they should be dealt with. Well, they do it for us. We can't escape the consequences, and therefore we shouldn't escape the cost of the pollution that our consumption causes. If you don't have proper pollution pricing, you are effectively saying we are all living beyond our environmental means. It's not sustainable, and therefore it will not be sustained. So you need to put in place, it's not a sufficient condition, but a necessary condition, a price on that pollution in order to get us to begin to change our behavior. And the thing about carbon prices is they are economically efficient, as I've said. They improve the efficiency of trade, because not to have a carbon price in trade is to distort trade. So if we have a carbon price here and China doesn't, that's an artificial trade subsidy to the Chinese, similarly to the Brazilians with respect to the beef example I gave you. So efficient trade is trade that carbon is priced at, and that means a carbon border price. It goes on to consumption, and it's sustainable. And by the way, and right now, this is actually quite pertinent and why I'm so enthusiastic and also optimistic about carbon prices. Governments need the money badly, and they've run out of lots of other things to tax. If the choice is between raising income taxes, for example, and raising pollution taxes, right now, pollution taxes have quite a lot of attraction. So you need to price carbon. So how do you do it? What's the way of introducing carbon pricing? So the first thing I'm going to say, which is different between you in Ireland and us in the UK after the 1st of January, when the transition period ends, is you're stuck with the EU ETS. We're not. The EU ETS is a terrible way to set a price. It's produced a short-term, volatile and low carbon price. And what the Commission has been doing over the last few years, and particularly now, is trying to manipulate the number of permits to produce the carbon price that the carbon tax would have set. And that, I think, is a big mistake. We in the UK have the opportunity on the 1st of January. There has to be some benefit from Brexit. I struggle normally to find any, but there has to be some. We can set our own carbon prices, and we have 3 considerations under consideration: following the EU ETS, so shadowing it, setting up our own EU ETS, which would be a disaster and chaotic, or having a carbon tax and then extending it to agriculture and transport. And I'm reasonably optimistic we're going to do the last, if not immediately, eventually. Now, the important thing is the price is the same on everything: agriculture, transport, domestic heating, and of course, electricity generation. In the UK, agriculture is 0.6% of GDP and produces 11% of recorded emissions, although that excludes peats and soils. So it's probably 15. So it's very hard to think of any less significant sector of the economy that produces such a disproportionate amount of carbon. And we, like many countries, subsidize the use of diesel in agriculture through our so-called red diesel. And we have a whole series of other areas of direct carbon pollution, which also damage biodiversity, pesticides, fertilizers, and so on, where the carbon and the other pollution costs are not included. So you put everything into the frame. It's a uniform price, and it applies to imports on the same basis as domestic, and it applies to carbon sequestration, and therefore helps the natural environment, creates incentives to develop the ability of the natural environment to incorporate more of the emissions and sequestrate them. You want to start low because the capital stock's given, and then you want to raise it over time in order to take up the strain. But remember, if we get to net zero carbon consumption, then the carbon tax will be zero. So this is a tax whose very success should be that it withers away. But if we don't get there, then it rises through time, and you want it to rise through time through the time dimension that people can replace the capital stock. So that's how you do a carbon tax, and that therefore incentivizes natural carbon sequestration and CCS, which is industrial sequestration. And as I said at the beginning, the net zero problem, the climate change problem, is about both sides of the equation, sequestration and emissions. And it's the sequestration that's been neglected. Indeed, our natural environment, instead of sequestrating carbon, has been emitting it. I think the soil contains roughly 4 times the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, And we all know what peat can do, but doesn't do as part of the way of absorbing carbon. So how do you do this? Well, the first thing you need to do when you're looking at sequestration on a natural basis is know what you've got. You've got to know what the baseline is before you can look at net additions to sequestration or the emissions. And the great news is that doing natural capital baselines is now a hell of a lot more straightforward than it was before. Still quite a long way to go in terms of incorporating soil data, peat data, and so on. But this isn't an exercise in perfection. It's much better to be roughly right than perfectly wrong. And all the time we're getting new data sets from probes, from apps, from drones to blend in with the satellite data to enable us to have those baselines and then to be able to repeat those baselines again and again and again to see how natural capital has changed. Now, you need to do this because nobody's going to pay for a carbon offset in the natural environment unless it can be accredited and demonstrated to have been an actual natural carbon bit of sequestration. And that's the repeating of the baseline to show that if you plant the trees, they really have sequestered the carbon. Now, lots and lots of particular landowners and farmers are going to have opportunities to do a field here or do a larger scale project somewhere else, both in enhancing soil sequestration and also in planting trees, hopefully the right trees in the right place that don't damage biodiversity at the same time. So what you do is you work these benefits out, and instead of having to sign a bilateral contract or have point regulation and subsidies, you simply upload the carbon sequestration that you're making with the accreditation to a platform, which is essentially a trading platform, and people can buy those offsets from you. This is a huge opportunity. We can do it with the EUTS, you can do it in this particular dimension. Now, of course, on top of that, you've got to provide for capital maintenance. These are assets in perpetuity which can't be allowed to decline. And you must, when you've sequestrated the carbon, for example, grown the tree, work out how you're going to store that carbon in that natural piece of capital, that product. So pelletizing the tree, turning it into a biomass fuel and burning it in a power station doesn't do the job. Although you could simply tax the emissions when it gets to the biomass plant, that's completely different than incorporating trees in timber and buildings for long periods and effectively burying the carbon in the buildings as opposed to burying the carbon in the soil, which is what soil-based sequestration will do. So that you do. Now, in addition, there is carbon sequestration storage, and that's about pumping carbon emissions back into empty oil and gas wells. Best place in the world to do that is the North Sea, because we've got loads of empty wells and we've got all the pipelines there in place. Will that do the job? Don't know. But from a global perspective, we've got to try it to make some contribution. But the really ambitious carbon sequestration stores are about saline aquifers and sequestration on a much greater scale. And I have to say, it's not at all clear what the environmental risks of that are going to be to our oceans and to our marine world. But the sequestration in existing wells where gas has come out, that's part of the frame. And again, a carbon price pays people for natural carbon sequestration and pays people for CCS. It's the negative price that makes this stick. Now, of course, carbon pricing isn't all that we need to do for net zero carbon consumption. We have to do the infrastructures, the public goods, because they won't be done by the private sector. And there's a huge amount of that infrastructure stuff to be done, to be driven by the state, even if it's carried out by the private sector. And that's about electric car charging infrastructures, might be for hydrogen for cars as well. It's about the infrastructure providing electric heating rather than gas heating. And it's really about green infrastructures, green natural capital systems, and making sure those on a landscape basis are there and capable of doing this stuff. And that brings in agriculture, it brings in digital manufacturing, and for each of these infrastructure systems, electricity system included, we need system plans, we need system regulation, and system operators. All doable and all will have to be done. Otherwise, we will waste enormous amount of resources on the chaos of multiple charging systems for cars, for example, product differentiation, lack of integration with electricity grids, and therefore a waste of a great deal of energy in the process. So that's the next component in the frame. And then, of course, we have to recognize that the existing technologies probably aren't going to do the job. I know there's enormous enthusiasm about the falling costs of wind and the falling costs of solar, and that's great, but the features of these forms of renewable electricity generation that remain are really quite important to bear in mind. The first thing to say is that wind and solar in their current configuration are incredibly low density energy sources. They're also incredibly decentralized, and they're also intermittent. So when people go around and saying wind is cheaper than fossil fuels, I ask myself two questions. The first one is, why aren't they outside the government buildings with placards saying end renewable subsidies now? If it's true that the renewables are cheaper, then we don't need any subsidies. We can abolish them. Now, of course, it's fair to say we need a carbon tax on the carbon polluting sources of energy. But even then, I suspect, and I sincerely think it's essential, that we need to carry on subsidizing renewables because they don't hack it on an equivalent firm power basis alongside the alternatives, including nuclear power. They might do in the future, but right now they are not fully cost competitive, so we can just abandon policy in this territory and just let it naturally happen. It isn't going to naturally happen. We have to make it happen in the renewable space. And if there are a lot of people running around who think that you can run a modern electricity system and a modern economy on just wind and solar, well, good luck to you. But if you look at the density of energy you require, even in countries with stable populations in Europe, it doesn't add up. And of course, it doesn't add up for moving from 7 billion people to 10 billion people globally. And what that tells me is, while we must push the existing renewables hard, and we should have a debate about nuclear power, I'm neither in favor nor against nuclear power, we have to march also at the same time on technical progress. And there's great news on the technical progress side. One part of that is clearly the new materials like graphene, for example, which have really very, very important properties. There's all the new battery technologies, but there's also solar film. You know, imagine a world where you could have solar film on everything, your clothes, the roads, the buildings, every a surface you can possibly think of. All of that is not completely impossible. And we're going to need much better solar technology if we're to crack climate change. Good news is sun comes up every day, produces more energy every day than the entire world's consumption of electricity in a year. So there's no shortage of energy. We're not going to run out of energy. The question is to find the technologies to harness it. So carbon price now, work on the infrastructures and do the R&D. That's really important in the frame. And that brings us back to carbon consumption yourselves and myself. So if it's us in the end that has to stop doing the polluting and pay the price of the pollution and have the facilities through the infrastructure and to have access to new technologies to make this more possible, this now then spells out the sheer scale of the carbon consumption net zero challenge. So what I suggest in my new net zero book is that you sit down and you write your own personal carbon diary. Now, I don't expect you to know the carbon components of each bit of your daily consumption, but the reason I would like you to write a carbon diary is I'd like you to be intrigued by it. I'd like you to start thinking about it and wondering what's going on. So when you get up in the morning, you probably flush the loo first. How much carbon went into the energy for that water system? And where was the paper made from? Then you're going to have breakfast. Where did the palm oil come from? That's in almost everything you eat for breakfast. Where's the packaging for the cereal box coming from? How are you cooking your breakfast? And then you'll go and get some fast fashion. It's stunning that the amount of time that any fashion item is now worn is dramatically lower than it even was 5 years ago. It's all riddled with carbon. And then you'll go to work. Well, you might do when you're not locked down. Think about the carbon involved in that. You might go on holiday on an aeroplane, or you might be a climate activist and want to fly from California to Oxford Circus to sit in a boat and fly back and do 5,500 miles round trip. Well, you should add up the carbon. And my point is the following. It's not to make you feel guilty about it. It's to make you understand that in 2050, if you want to be net zero carbon consumption, you would have to rewrite that diary. And I suggest if you're young enough, you put it in a drawer and get it out in 250, what you wrote down you were doing now. And you will have to be able to write that diary down without most of that carbon in it. That's the scale of the challenge we confront. It's perfectly doable, but it's not going to be achieved by deluding ourselves. Either when we get to zero emissions, we won't be causing climate change, or that just by getting to zero on net carbon territorial emissions, that somehow we will no longer be responsible for all that carbon that's being emitted and going into all that global trade, which we import when we close down domestically our carbon intensive industries. So if we want to not have another 30 wasted years, we must focus on the right variables. We must get back into natural capital and natural sequestration, and we must focus down on pricing pollution, putting the infrastructure in place, and spending the money on R&D. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Dieter. That was great, fascinating, really interesting. And thank you for your perspective. I like the idea of both bottom-up and top-down approaches to achieving net zero. Thank you very much, great. We do have some questions that are coming on the chat. What I'm going to do actually is to ask people if they'd like to ask the questions themselves. So Orla, could you unmute people? So while Orla's doing that, I'll just give thanks to Orla Delagi, who's the Executive Coordinator for the Irish Forum on Natural Capital, who has been organising this event, and Juan Valverde from Trinity, who helped set up the event as well. So thank you very much to both of you. So I'd like to invite Susan Murphy. Susan's the leader of the Masters in Development Practice here at Trinity. Susan, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, thanks so much, Jane, and thank you, Professor Helm. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to join you this evening. Thanks to the Forum for coordinating this event. I have the great privilege in Trinity of teaching a masterclass on climate justice, and we just started our classes this week, and so this lecture comes at a perfect time, and I'm delighted to see some of my students on the session today. Professor Helm, I have two sets of questions, if I may, and they very much range around the justice and fairness elements of the proposals that you have shared with us today. So I think there's much of what you have said that many will celebrate and welcome, and I think the focus and the overall objectives of the arguments are absolutely to be lauded and commended. But I do want to raise some questions around some of the normative claims of the argument that you've presented to us here today. And I'm sure, and I do apologize if these are questions that they're old and boring to you. They most likely are, given your expertise and indeed your internationally recognized profile. But my first question really is around the normative claim that you make around what should a unilateral net zero policy look like. And it's really around that idea of net zero, actually, that I'd like to ask a question. Sorry, forgive me, my phone is already going. So when in that discussion and in your justification of focusing on net zero rather than zero carbon emissions, you focus very heavily around the role of China, for example, and the historical emissions within China over the last 30 years and the historical emissions from India and indeed from Africa. But we know, and you know very well, that the per capita emissions from China, India, and indeed from Africa are significantly lower than the per capita emissions in the European or the US, the Australian, the Canadian contexts. And there's many different reasons to explain that. And I suppose I was a little bit curious to understand why there's a focus on the last 30 years and historical emissions of these particular locations without a sufficient consideration of the historical contributions from the UK and Europe, which go back significantly before those 30 years and indeed have contributed very substantially to the high degree of warming that we have seen to this point. And so I suppose my question really around this is, you know, where does this fit in with the right to development for countries that have significant issues related to poverty and underdevelopment in terms of their industries and manufacturing and so on? And where does this leave us in terms of queries and questions around the right of certain states, and particularly of those wealthier and higher emitting states, you know, to be able to continue with that privilege of continuing to emit and indeed not seeking to take actions to actually reduce the emissions in the atmosphere through a more ambitious objective rather than net zero. So that's really the first kind of range of questions that I have, and it's really around that normative claim and the historical context of that claim and the rights of states to develop, recognizing that we are asking states to develop, we are asking states, lower income locations, to develop in a way that our states have not developed. And so that's quite a big ask. They're being asked not to use natural resources. The second question I have relates to the polluter pays argument and the carbon taxes. So as you will know, and as I'm sure everybody here knows, that's not a new proposal. Carbon taxes have been a hot topic, and indeed the polluter pays principle has been on the agenda for the European Union for at least since the 1970s. And so as a consequence, there's some fantastic research around this particular topic. And one of the biggest concerns, of course, is that a flat tax, such as a carbon tax, can be highly unjust in driving inequality and poverty because it tends to have the greatest impact on the poorest populations. And so my question really is not, I mean, in the Irish context, I'm sure you're probably familiar, but in the Irish context, there is actually some evidence of some consensus around a carbon tax. But it's not simply based on the polluter pays principle. So through the Citizens' Assembly, which was constructed to examine Ireland's climate action and what citizens would be willing to do in order to improve Ireland's record in this space, it was agreed that they would endorse a carbon tax, but that it was only if the funds were ring-fenced and reused into renewable energy solutions, so into the research and development, such that we could actually transition away from carbon-based energy systems. And secondly, that the poorest would be protected. And so that system is actually a blend between a polluter pays and an ability to pay. And I was wondering if you could just reflect a little bit and share your thoughts a little bit on that. And then the final question I have related to the polluter pays and carbon taxes is why focus only on individualizing taxes and focus on the consumer rather than focusing on the supply chain and increased regulations of supply chain? Because quite often consumers are not aware necessarily of the supply chain and of the emissions that are added through that process. So we could make them aware and we could indeed tax that, and or we could seek to regulate that supply chain and industries that have such direct control over the emissions that they themselves are responsible for pumping and utilizing through that process. And if I can, and you don't have to answer this at all, but again, one of the final comments on your slide was that you're seeking a solution in order to have sustainable economic growth. And my question really is, you know, how does that cohere, or does that cohere, or what is your perspective around Tim Jackson's arguments around prosperity without growth? Sorry, Jane, for hogging the space and asking too many questions, but it was a fascinating conversation and I couldn't resist the opportunity to raise them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Susan.
So let me go through your excellent questions. I'll start with the last one. The Tim Jackson point, I think, is completely wrong. So it's absolutely right that current growth as measured by GDP is not a good measure on a whole variety of levels. But the idea that you shouldn't have growth is, in my view, basically saying you shouldn't have technical progress. So if you look at what happens, I think the current level of consumption is too high. It has to come down to a sustainable level. But if you look what's going on around us, in my lifetime, I've gone from Tipex, a carbon paper and a typewriter, to a computer in my pocket in my iPhone, which is better than Oxford University's computer in 1980. That's technical progress. And ultimately, that leaves my possibilities greater than they were back at that date in 1980 or 84 or whenever I was doing my thesis. And the technical progress going on around us, which are absolutely essential for addressing climate change and poverty and a whole variety of things, is a good thing. And it makes the possibility for us humans greater. But that's not the same as GDP. But zero growth, have you ever thought what that society would look like and what it would involve? And I think Tim's completely misguided in that view. But that's my simple answer to that. I'm writing a book on sustainable economy at the moment, and happy to come back and debate that at much greater length. On the other 2 points, so on the historical legacy, okay, so I'm starting with the question, how do we deal with climate change? And we're on a path where we're going to fry. And that's going to fry us, but it's going to fry the people in the developed countries much more. You just have to look at the geography and the location of the higher temperatures and what happens. So climate change, as it happens, it's already happening, is really bad for the poorer people on this planet. It's also true that if China follows the current growth path, and if India replicates it, and if Africa replicates it too, which is what's happening, we will fry. So, I mean, in a very serious sense, what you do in Ireland will make no real difference to the temperature on this planet later this century. What happens in those 3 areas, with effectively 6 billion of the 10 billion people by the end of the century, really matters. Now, I thought you would quite like the idea that I should pay for the consequences of the pollution caused by that development, rather than the Chinese or the globe generally. So my first point is actually distributionally very different from what the Europeans thought they were pursuing, although it's good news the EU is minded to have a carbon border tax. The historical question, well, it's like slavery and a whole lot of things. Making a contribution of a percentage of EU and US GDP to these countries, there is an argument for doing that, which isn't just about climate change. But I look around and observe that countries struggle to get to 1% of GDP to do that. And I'm horrified today the UK government is thinking about rolling back even from those contributions. But you're right, there's an argument to have. There's an argument about whether the British should pay money to the Caribbean states in order to make retribution for the recompense for the damage done. I have no difficulty with that. That doesn't change my argument one iota. But the other argument you come forward is the carbon tax issue and the distributional impacts. So I think that it would be wrong to say that we should have a different price for bread for people who are poorer than people who are richer. But I think that we should have a welfare system which provides people with the income and the resources to pay for the consumption that they rightly should engage in. So I think distorting relative prices in an economy in order to achieve your distributional objectives is the wrong thing to do. I think the right thing to do is set the right prices, including for carbon, and set the right welfare policies to think about compensating the less well-off in society for all the problems they have, including the price of bread and the price of carbon. So that's the adjustment I've made. Whether you should ring fence the money and recycle it, well, that depends whether you think that amount of revenue accruing to the government, the first call should be on climate change before any of the other considerations like health, vaccines, and all those other things. And I'm slightly old-fashioned. I think revenue raising is distinct from spending. And I think there are flaws on both sides of that argument. So I don't think what you're saying is actually inconsistent with what I'm trying to do. And I do think that regardless of whether the rich countries do or do not compensate the poor countries, anyone interested in climate change has to recognize if it isn't cracked in China, if it isn't cracked in India, and if it isn't cracked in Africa, we are going to fry. We are where we are. It's not a good place to be. And I have to say, Chinese emissions today are vastly higher than industrial revolution emissions were in the United States and in Europe. This is an order of magnitude different. There were 2 billion people in 2000. You know, the economy in the UK in the Industrial Revolution was growing at 1% per year. China's doubling every 7 to 15 years. The burn of coal is an order of magnitude different from anything we did in industrialization, terrible though quite a lot of that stuff was.
Thank you so much, Susan, for your questions, and Dieter for the discussion. I think it's really excellent and interesting, and I think the two of you could have a long conversation, but I'm going to move on. There's another few questions in the chat here. Kian Mintz-Wu, apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name properly. Would you like to ask your question?
Certainly. Yes, thank you. So fabulous talk. Thank you so much. So I agree that what's changed in terms of the political palatability of carbon taxes is this need for revenue. So we have these really bad fiscal positions at various different levels of government. But I think that there's two things that still remain that really worry me. So the first is public acceptability. So I do think that economists have been advocating carbon taxes for a long time, and we've had very little take-up on this. And the little bit of take-up that we've had doesn't help, because the second point is, so I think that's true, especially in the United States. But the second point is where it has been introduced. So I'm thinking of Australia as being a really good case. It was, of course, revoked when the other government came in. So how do we have a policy life cycle analysis where we keep that policy and keep it strengthened? So British Columbia might give us a good case, but Australia gives us a really negative case. And I'm worried that we'd see more of those. Thanks so much.
So I think this is a really fundamental issue, and it's the following. There are a whole bunch of people running around saying it isn't going to cost you anything to do climate change. It's a great economic growth opportunity. And what's more, we can borrow loads of money and maybe print it, and it'll all be fine. And particularly people of the Keynesian persuasion tell us that we can have green growth, but nobody's going to have to pay anything. We'll just print it, or we'll just have very large fiscal deficits. Okay, so the next generation is going to get the debt. Oh, but anyway, we'll do the policy. My view, and it goes back to my book on carbon crunch a long time ago, and one of the reasons why so many environmentalists get upset by me, is I think it's going to be really expensive to convert an almost overwhelmingly carbon intensive economy to one that doesn't have much carbon in it within 30 years. I think it's a huge endeavor. And I compare it with 1936 and a peacetime economy, and then fighting the Battle of Britain with a wartime economy in 1941. Nobody in their right minds would have said in 1936, let's rearm, let's borrow a huge sum of money, and let's build loads and loads of bombs. And by the way, you're not going to have to pay any cost towards this. You're going to be better off. Right? It's utter nonsense. This is a huge challenge in a short period of time. And I think there's a deep political dishonesty in not telling people the truth about what it's going to mean to their unsustainable standard of living, which is based on not paying for the pollution they cause, to make the trajectory to paying for it. And therefore you get these opinion polls. There was a lovely one quoted in the press in Britain today saying everyone in the poor so-called red wall, blue wall seats in the northeast, which the British government's obsessed with, are against phasing out petrol and diesel cars, but they're overwhelmingly in favour of dealing with climate change. Well, why? Because they've been told it isn't going to cost them anything. And when you work out what this investment programme really will require, you know, everything from putting the peat bogs back into proper shape, to stopping the stripping out of the soil, the carbon from the soils, to dealing with our natural environment, to dealing with the electrification of cars, to phasing out coal and fossil fuels, to relying on this decentralized intermittent technology. When you work out what that's going to cost, you know, it's a complete delusion that you have a population that thinks I'm going to pay for anything. So when you say you're going to pay a carbon tax, oh my God, no, of course I don't want to pay a carbon tax. That'll make me worse off. Well, my answer is fine. You want to fry, do you? Right? Because that's the implication. Unless we're prepared to walk the walk of paying for what we have to do, for the damage that my generation has done to this planet, unless we're prepared to pay for that and realize we're living beyond our sustainable economic means, doesn't mean there can't be growth in the future. Unless we're prepared to do that, we're not being honest about addressing climate change. That's the point I've been making in 2010, 2011, and in my Carbon Crunch book. And I think, you know, when Boris Johnson's favorite hero, Churchill, talked about blood, sweat, and tears to fight the Second World War, What he meant was, you're not going to be better off to do this in the short run. You're going to have to face up to those consequences. And that's what I believe is true here. And so when people say, oh, can't have a carbon tax, you know, people won't pay for it. So I say, well, don't give me the stuff about you'll care about climate change, because you won't will the means, but you'll just simply stand up and grandstand in Paris or in Glasgow in the COP and will the ends. That's not enough. And that's why we wasted 30 years. And we cannot have the 30 years to 250 going on at 2 parts per million. Sorry, I'm being a bit over the top on this, but it's absolutely central to this point. It's back to the moral and ethical questions, which Susan asked too. We can't avoid those. And I'm an academic. I believe in telling the truth. And the truth is, to me, and I'd love to be proved wrong, this is going to cost a lot. And I'm desperately keen that we spend it and pay that, but we have to lower our standard of living to get onto a sustainable path. And this is a point too. If you say to people, you know what, we're living beyond our sustainable environmental means, I think nearly everyone will agree with that proposition. But if you agree with that proposition, you must agree, therefore it will not be sustained. It's not going to work, right? But then people don't buy that conclusion. But it's true. We're going to fry. I mean, not in the literal sense, but we're going to have 2, 3, 4 degrees of warming. So that's your choice. And I don't duck that at all. I don't duck the political difficulties that are involved in that. And if people aren't prepared to have a carbon tax and they're not prepared to pay for the pollution, they either got to pay for a more expensive way of getting to the same outcome, or they don't actually want to do anything about climate change. That's my view.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the excellent questions. Now, I'm very conscious that we've reached 6 o'clock, and I don't want to keep anyone from their dinner. So what I'm going to propose is that we call a halt now. We have all the questions saved here in the chat, and I'm going to ask Dieter if he'd be kind enough to maybe address some of those questions afterwards. But I just think, you know, it's really, this discussion really raises the point that we need to be talking across disciplines. We need economists, philosophers, ecologists, political scientists, ethical scientists, social scientists. This conversation of addressing environmental issues and climate change and ecosystem degradation really does require this discussion across disciplines. So we're extremely grateful to you for making the time to come and speak to us this evening, Dieter, and thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending and for your questions. I think it's been a really excellent discussion. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to deal with questions to the extent that I'm able to. And thank you for the questions that have been asked. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thanks all.